Serious. Employers of Reddit, what is the weirdest or creepiest thing you found during a background check on a potential employee? Hey y'all, I'm here. Let's see how real some of these get, from tiny infractions to full-on crimes. Story 1. One just came up, but it was not an employee, but someone who was threatening a friend of mine. I have to keep a lot of details vague, but I think the gist will come across. In my industry, we have guests for our events. Some of them are well-known actors and writers. Some are famous industry folks. And then there's a lot of people who are on the tail edge of fame, who are known for one thing like a YouTube channel or something. Someone applied to be a guest at her event. Let's call him Dave, who has a list of credits that seem dubious. 1. Dave claims to have been a game designer, listing several popular legacy cult games, along the lines of Duke Nukem, Quake, N64 James Bond, Pokemon Stadium, that sort of thing. All of them belong to the same big league company. Let's call it Pansy and Mount. Dave also claims to have been in a few Pansy Mount productions as a voice actor, script editor, and so on. 2. Dave has several awards under his belt from Pansy and Mount. 3. Dave has been a guest at several conventions. 4. Dave has created several conventions in the span of his career. So she looked them up. None of the games have him listed in the credits. The span of what he's claimed to work on, when subtracted from his age, would mean he started working for Pansy Amount when he was just 9 years old. His link to his IMDb page does not exist. When you cross-reference him to his acting and writing, only his name comes up in his own credits, like his Facebook page, listings under guest details at a few small conventions, his own website. Same with these Pansy Amount Excellent Awards, which do not exist at Pansy Amount. And we have industry contacts who can verify such things in a single phone call. The only reference to them is the same as his self-posted credit above. Dave's conventions guest listings can be only 50% verified. Big, well-known conventions don't have him listed at all. Small conventions have him listed, but we're talking 100 to 200 people. One-day events at a local college. The rest are his own conventions. His own conventions have locations and addresses that are either hard to verify. Veteran halls, elk lodges, hotel function rooms, or downright don't exist as function space one can have an event. Restaurants, storage facilities, vacant lots, or non-existent. There are a few people like him, like this in our industry. The sad thing is that he's one of the few who have convinced a fan base to promote him. And if you turn him down, he'll demand to know why. If you tell him nothing you claim seems verifiable, he'll lose his crap. He'll threaten you. He'll claim libel and he'll sue you. Somebody commented, Dave has issues. I agree with that comment wholeheartedly. I know a lot of freelancers, myself included, who have a couple random claims to fame, like working on some popular books or less well-known movies. But so many people will be honest when you ask them about their work. This guy honestly sounds like a lot of the stereotypical modern influencers who think they're hot crap and try to claim they've done everything. But when you check out their work, it's just plain mediocre. Story 2. This happened to me in February 2016. This woman interviewed with me and I made her an offer contingent on her passing a state background check. She suddenly tries telling me I don't need to run one on her, in which I reply, I absolutely need to, and it was state regulation. She let it go. I run the background, which takes about 2 full business days, before I can get the results and leave my office for the weekend. Come back on the Wednesday afterwards, and the background is waiting. There were more red flags than I've ever seen. This was a few of the things that came back. 1. Criminal harassment. 2. A pending felony DUI with leaving the scene of an accident. 3. Endangering the welfare of a child. I obviously call the woman and tell her we would not be able to hire her, and she wigs out on the phone, calling me a liar and other nonsense. So I calmly read all of her information she gave me back to her, and she confirmed it all, but couldn't explain the results. I stand by my decision and tell her, good luck. Wasn't done though, unfortunately. I leave for lunch and come back to my secretary telling me that I had a couple there to see me. Lady shows up with her boyfriend and tries to intimidate me into changing my mind. I read her the state regulations verbatim and told her it could cost us our provider number. I wish I was making this next part up. With this guy present, she offers me a BJ to overlook all of this and hire her. At this point, I tell her to leave my office and tell her not to come back. I tell my secretary under no circumstances to let them back into the building, and call the executive director and owner to tell them about what happened. During the call, I get a post-it note from my secretary who tells me that the couple are out in the parking lot looking around at cars and she called the police. Cops show up and they think of some BS excuse like they lost their keys in the lot. I immediately told the police what happened and they escorted them off the property. Yeah, I feel like the second someone says you don't have to run a background check is when you need to. Sounds like this job might have had something to do with healthcare. Where, yeah, the last thing I want is someone who has a history of being drunk in a vehicle, harassing people, and hurting kids. And the cherry on top, she's a cheater. So yeah, I don't think you lost anything good, OP. Story 3. My story doesn't exactly fit the question because I was not the employer in the case, but it's along the same lines. I used to work in a place that also provided volunteer employment for men getting out of prison, to give them retail experience and something to put on their resume. We were not generally told what sort of offenses the men were incarcerated for. Our supervisor knew, but the employees were not given that information. However, a lot of the time, they would tell us themselves. Usually it was things like drug charges or fraud. There was one man, however, that always stood out. He seemed very well educated, well-spoken, and very organized. I'm not saying that well-educated people never go to prison. Of course they do. However, the men we usually dealt with generally didn't fit that description. My coworkers and I were all curious what kind of crime he might have committed. One day, one of my coworkers happened to see a piece of paper or something with his name on it. We usually only know them by their first names. He decided to Google it. Obviously, we are not supposed to do that, hence the no last names policy. But he did anyway, and we discovered that this guy had killed one of his foster children. We were all a little shocked. We'd had murders before, but they'd have been drug beef and crap like that, not child killers. I had a hard time working with him after that, but luckily he was only with us for a few months. He never did tell us himself what he had done, and of course we couldn't say anything. It was awkward though. Yeah, this is one to me that I don't know if I would be able to ever see or work with the guy the same. I think that sometimes, and very rarely, murder is justified. Like, self-defense is a case where I completely understand it. But killing a child? Someone who relies on you for support after losing their family. I'm surprised the dude was even let out and hired in the first place. I know people can change, but that to me just seems so hard to forgive. Story 4. Interviewed a woman once and it went pretty well. I had a cubicle, so we used my boss's office. Since my boss was out of town, she gives the right answers and has related experience in a somewhat specialized field. Calm, composed, generally on point. Mentally, I'd placed her in the top 2 contenders. When I got back to my desk from dropping her off at the elevator bank, there was an email from HR with the subject line, "Please call us immediately." The voicemail light is also flashing. What follows are a series of gradually more panicked messages from the HR rep, starting with, "Hello, Alan. This is your HR rep. Hoping to catch you before your interview. Call me." Ending with, "Alan, call me right now." Apparently, when the candidate came in, HR made a mistake and sent her on the wrong interview, with another manager offering a similar position, but not the one she was looking for. She figured this out, abruptly and somewhat rudely ended the interview, then went back to HR. This manager called up HR and said, "Hey, there's been a mistake, but you should know this person went kind of bonkers." In HR, the candidate screamed at the assistant, called her names like stupid and the R slur, then insisted on going on the interview with me. The assistant was a newbie and sent her on the correct interview, then went into her boss's office and broke down in tears. The calls were various HR people trying to locate this person and have her escorted from the building. Story 5. I was a hiring manager for a while at my place of employment. Had a decent candidate. He was applying for an overnight position, so his slight lack of social skills wasn't too bad. He had a decent work history and told us he'd been through a recent divorce and had been down on his luck for a while, which explained an 18-month gap in employment. He answered no to the conviction question. His drug test was fine, so I started his background check and told we'd bring him back in to finish up paperwork once it returned. 4 days later, the check was still pending, which usually suggests that the candidate has some sort of record, and our HR department is investigating. A week and a half passes and the candidate has called a few times asking, "What's up?" I have no answer. Finally, I get the big "do not hire" on his status, as well as an email from HR. The email was basically along the lines of, "Do not hire candidate. Do not contact candidate. If a candidate comes into your location, insist he leaves immediately." I never saw the guy after that, and I don't know what they found. It's a good thing the guy never came back in, but I feel like OP's work should have warned them, considering they basically told them to run if the dude ever came back in. Story 6. I've got some weird employment stories, but here's one of the more unusual. I had recently been hired via a contracted group for an IT-related job. Long story short, I was sitting in orientation the first day, getting assigned a user ID and such, the very basics. They did the drug test already, so everyone had been cleared, but because they were rushing to get a group in, background checks had not all been cleared. There's a knock at the door of the training room. Local sheriff step in and ask for the guy who happens to be sitting right next to me. He was a young kid, maybe 20 or 21 if I had to guess. He stands up and leaves. The rest of the day we made a few jokes about whether we should box up his things. The trainer tells us he won't be returning and doesn't comment further. A few days later, there's an article in the paper. The kid had a warrant for his arrest for a murder charge. As if things weren't already a little crazy. About a week later, a surveillance tape is released on the news that this kid shot someone in broad daylight in what seemed like a small robbery. It was pretty crazy piecing everything together once I realized it all. Story 7. I was a hiring manager for a seasonal store. We only actually did background checks on anyone applying for management, but during my interviews, I had to ask the applicants if they could pass a background check. As long as they said yes, they were clear. Bad logic, right? So during the season, one of my employees let it slip that she wouldn't pass a background check. I wasn't overly worried about it and assumed she had some drug charges or something. Out of curiosity, I Googled her name that night and learned that she'd been arrested for prostitution over 10 times in 3 months, several years prior. She also had a charge for continuing to prostitute after she found out she had HIV. After this, I got super curious about everyone else and ended up Googling all of them. One of my associates had a charge from several years prior, where he and his cousin had broken into an elderly couple's home and kidnapped the gentleman, driving him to an ATM and having him withdraw money for him. I hope OP's store installed a policy after that to start doing background checks for everyone, even if they said they would pass. Story 8. Throwaway response, kinda on subject. I have a criminal record, and I've managed to find work over the years. Partly because I work behind bars and I was self-employed for a while. Also, partly because I now live permanently in Europe and they can't get to my criminal history. What's worrying to me is that I've now found a career that I really enjoy over here, working with children. My criminal record didn't show on my now home nation's check. I have not yet had to fill an application form, so I haven't lied. I just hope that as laws become more tight, it doesn't come up, and if it does, they will overlook it. And just to clarify, my conviction was for fraud. I overpaid a lot of money when I noticed I made the wrong choice and spent it, then tried to cover my tracks when the questions started. It's nothing dodgy, but I don't announce it at parties. Story 9. When my mom had her business, she was letting me recruit people because of my, as she calls it, computer skills. So one day a guy applied and seemed nice at first. The interview was going well. He was all suited up and classy. After checking his documents, I did some research on him. Couldn't find anything about that guy before 2013. 2 days later, when we interviewed some more people, we were interrupted by the police asking if they could ask some questions. They showed us a pic of the guy that was applying and asked if we knew where he is. So we gave them all the documents he left there for us. Turned out he was searched for murdering 2 people and identity theft. Well, some days later, they found him and informed us. We still don't know why he applied for a job at our business, but I don't even want to know why. It's a good thing you decided to take the time and investigate the guy before you let him sit in a store alone with your mom. Story 10. Kind of the other side of the coin. I live in a very small country in Southeast Asia. My name is common in my home Western country, which stands out as foreign here. When you Google my name in this Asian country, there immediately comes about 50 references to a jailed pedophile in the country's capital. He's also from my home country and about my same age. It creeps me out to think that my employer, prospective employer, or new friends might make a misconnection if they try to check me out on Google. Somebody commented, there is one other person on earth with my name. He's an absolute R-word and a true embarrassment. I've had odd questions from family and employers regarding his antics. I even reached out to him once to let him know that he was freaking me up. I think he doubled his efforts at freaking his life up just to mildly inconvenience me. Story 11. Years ago, I was interviewing someone who listed being a supervisor at a Starbucks as part of her resume. I asked her to share a story about tough conflict resolution. She shares that she caught an employee stealing. She said it was tough because she couldn't tell anyone. Why? Because it would get him in trouble. Okay, so how did you deal with it? I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't stop. So whenever he was gonna steal something, I did it for him so he wouldn't get in trouble. There was no sense of wrongdoing on her part. No guilt. Seemed kind of proud of her answer, perhaps thinking I'd be quite impressed with how she handled it. I walked out and had a hard time figuring out if this was one of those fancy interview consultants that higher up sent to see how we would react, or if she was just nuts. Story 12. We hired a temp who seemed really sketchy. She dressed okay, but smelled like she took a bath in perfume. She had the attention span of a gnat, but I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. She went to lunch and I found her Facebook, and she looks super strung out in all the pics. She comes back from lunch 2 hours later saying she got lost. She didn't drive. She hung out in the parking lot after work for an hour and a half till her office admin called her a cab. One of the girls finds her on Facebook and says she's friends with a mutual acquaintance, who says she's super into drugs. She shows up the next day and is sleeping at the desk with the girl training her. She says it's some new meds. Escorted her out at the door at that point. OP seems like a super nice person for trying to give the girl a second chance and not pass judgment. I really do feel for people who are trying to turn their lives around, but I also get OP needing to prioritize their job and their employees' safety. Story 13. So I worked at a Rite Aid as a pharmacist, and we were looking for a pharmacy tech. Girl comes in with face tattoos and I don't know how many piercings. My dip crap pharmacy manager hires her because at least she has experience. Background check came back okay. She had an attitude and was terrible with customers. A former tech who moved on to work with the town police did his own check on her and found a few assault records and her mugshot. He told us to Google it, and there it was. Dip Crap's manager still didn't fire her. Took an HR intervention to get her to put on indefinite suspension. 2 months later, she contacted me to ask if I could be a reference for a job in Chicago. Lord, so hard. Somebody commented, implying facial piercing affects one's ability to hand out packets of pills. Story 14. Interviewed a guy for a night stalking position that required a certain amount of independent work because the night team was a pretty skeleton crew. Maybe 3 or 4 people tops for a large store all night. The boss was former RCMP and really strict about having people pass background checks, especially for positions where they'd be handling money or spending a lot of time alone. This guy swore up and down that the only thing in his record was a DUI from 15 years previously. He changed his life, been to rehab, etc., and it would be fine. Criminal check came back with literally over a dozen convictions. Multiple DUIs, B&Es, theft, assault, parole violations, failure to appear, you name it. It was a smorgasbord of crap. Called him back to ask WTF. He said, "Oh, I didn't think any of that would show up." Story 15. Wasn't in charge of hiring, but I used to run background checks for potential workers and volunteers at an animal shelter. A middle-aged guy wanted to volunteer, and we have to make sure that people don't have any history of animal abuse, among other things. Found a nasty assault and theft charge against him from 10 years prior. And after that, it was like the guy completely disappeared off the radar. Had to call and ask him to explain what he did during those years because there might be a mistake. Couldn't get a hold of him. A couple more days passed and I see his mugshot on the news. He was in prison and had just escaped 2 days prior to wanting to volunteer and was on the run. Again, it's like that one story, the dude who applied and got caught by the cops. What is with people and trying to find jobs immediately? It's so confusing that this dude busted out of jail and then immediately thought, let's go pet some dogs. Story 16. Was hiring somebody who put a different name on his application than the one in his passport. He was using his passport as proof of eligibility to work in the UK. I asked him about this and he said he changed his name recently, but didn't offer up a reason as to why. He seemed like a lovely guy and was more than qualified for the position, but I decided to Google his original name just to make sure. First few hits were news stories from local papers about him being a notorious football hooligan and having been to prison for glassing a 60-year-old man in a pub. I believe in second chances, but he knowingly lied on his application, which told me that he probably hadn't changed. Story 17. Trucking company a few years back. With the lack of drivers, we were told, if he has a pulse, he is 80% in. So we fast-tracked this guy. Monday, 3-day orientation. He is a full 100% driver by Friday. As we are booking him a load, he said next Tuesday he has to be home. Ask him why. Me. Okay, assuming it is a minor thing, can you go back out on Thursday? Driver. I got a court date. I don't know, it depends on the judge. Me, what do you mean? Driver. I'm up for double attempted murder. He was fired before his first trip. Story 18. I'm not the employer, but I remember the whole situation. A new salesman was needed in a small but growing company. The advert went out and they interviewed multiple candidates. One was successful and he joined. He was ex-RAF and seemed to be a decent being until a fellow staff member decided to Google him and see what comes up. I do this. He had been in prison for fraud, selling false insurance to young drivers. This was serious as our company dealt with insurance companies and similar clients. He was fired and kicked out on the spot. As he should be. There are some crimes that are pretty general where you're like, yeah, I would never hire them. But then there are these specialized crimes where it is so obvious why the person is trying to work at this specific location and what their end goal is. Part of me wants to give the dude credit for having the biggest pair I've read about in a while. Story 19. I need to hire a person who did cold calling for me a few years ago. Came across a woman on Indeed.com that I thought was perfect for the job. So I started looking her up online and came across her Facebook page. It was basically covered with nothing but anti-Obama rants and claiming he was the literal Antichrist. And she had links to her YouTube page where she had a video explaining how she had a dream that proves this. Suffice to say, I never contacted her. Story 20. Girl was hired before her background check results came back as the position desperately needed to be filled. 2 days later, she was let go once it came out that she'd been convicted of illegally disposing of a corpse. Her explanation was that someone had overdosed in her and her significant other's home, and that they didn't want to be charged for that. Somebody commented, "This is why you fill out all the proper forms before dumping inconvenient corpses at the local playground at 3 a.m. Story 21. Not in HR, but I sit next to them and often hear amazing tales. Weirdest one I can think of was a guy who on his resume listed a special skill of, I can tell if someone has diarrhea just by their smell, along with an extensive explanation of his ability to diagnose gastrointestinal problems by using his nose. On a resume. Googling his name led into turn to various fetish websites, and well, he was out of the running. I feel like that is a very specific skill that nearly everyone has. I mean, if I smell poop, I'm pretty sure I can take an educated guess that that person has diarrhea. And hey, that's what they college education and EMT certification. Story 22. I'm a healthcare recruiter. A surprising amount of RNs were once prostitutes, at least in Milwaukee. Also, Facebook is where the real dirt comes out. Yeah, it's true employers can't discriminate based on it, but they all do. If you talk about drugs, baby daddy drama, partying, and crap-talking your employers on social media, don't expect your career to go far. I just use Reddit. Makes no sense to me why you'd want anything about your life made public. Story 23. My manager told me a story about an interview he had with the candidate that was perfect. Near the end, they had already decided he was the guy and started talking more casually about what he did in his free time. His response to "what's your favorite hobby" was heroin and blow. He didn't get the job. Somebody commented, "I'm sorry, I thought this was America." That guy. Story 24. OMG, my chance. I ran a background check on a completely respectable woman with a good resume, wearing a nice suit. When we got it back, it included prostitution, drug possession, intent to sell, terroristic threats, 3 DUIs, and several indecent exposure charges. I had to call her and tell her it wouldn't work out. She couldn't figure out why not for the life of her. I feel bad. But depending on how old the charges are, I can fully understand why OP did what they did. Like, if they're pretty old charges, then it could be that she's just trying to change her life. But yeah, if it's recent charges, then it may be better to be safe than sorry. Story 25. Was interviewing potential candidates for a driving position. A 60-year-old male comes in, wins me over, heart and soul. Just a real dedicated guy. Really professed the love of his family. Extremely polite. Background search revealed several drug charges and armed robberies from over 20 years ago. I really wanted to hire him anyway, but that was a huge no-go at my company. Story 26. We were hiring people to be security officers and had one guy that did great on interview and was a shoo-in. When we got to the background back, we found out he had recently gotten out of jail for stealing airplanes and currently had a warrant out for his arrest. Job service thought he would be a good fit for security. Story 27. The worst is the theft from my employer. I had a guy come in with that and I sat back and realized I'd rather hire a murderer than this guy. The murderer's chance of killing a coworker probably lower, and technically I'm not liable for that if it happens. God forbid. But a theft, I'm totally liable. Yeah, this is really annoying that it is also put on the manager, even if it's not the employee. That being said, it's also hella annoying as an employee to get in trouble if a customer steals from you when you were trying to help them out. Happened to me once, and I was lucky my boss was so sweet, because I just broke down crying, and she thankfully didn't yell at me or anything. Story 28. Sean Eckhart, the bodyguard who hired the guy who whacked Nancy Kerrigan in the shins during 1994 U.S. Figure Skating Championships. Applied under an assumed name. He's dead now, so I don't think this is a rules violation. In a sea of murderers, pedos, and every imaginable kind of felon and scumbag, this is the one that stands out. Story 29. Many years ago, I made an offer to someone in the healthcare field. His background check was fine, but his state licensure dragged on, so we couldn't let him work until then. License never came through, because after we had run the background check, he killed his grandmother, who he lived with, by stabbing her multiple times. Story 30. I wasn't doing the hiring, but my coworker was. A girl came in and interviewed for my work, and everything went really well, and my coworker was planning on hiring her. A few days later, there's a news article with her face on it. Apparently, she attacked someone with a hammer. We were pretty shaken. At least it happened before you got too serious with her and did all of the onboarding and training. Although it would be a little funny if she didn't show up for work one day and you see the news. Funny, not in a haha way, but like a oh damn way. Story 31. One of the first things we do is Google you and check out your Facebook. My favorite profile picture was of this girl's butt. Zoomed in, lacy underwear. Made me laugh. Lock down your Facebook and have a decent profile picture before you turn in your resume. Story 32. UK people. Anyone know if a background check will show former names or just things associated with it? For example, would it say Mr. Former Name worked for this place this time? Not a big deal. I don't have any kind of criminal record. Just curious. Story 33. I once interviewed a guy for a mental health care position who turned out to be a dedicated and outspoken neo-Nazi. He was really open about it on his Facebook. I found it extremely creepy, since I'm Black and Arabic, and he was super polite to me. Well, that was a story. I never understood people who believe that kind of crap in today's day and age. Like, freedom of speech, I get it. I really do. But at some point, it's not speech so much as hate. And to go into a healthcare position where you are obligated to provide care for everyone, regardless of race, seems stupid if you know you hate so many different ethnicities. Story 34. Got a resume for a vet tech position from someone with an MD. Well, that just doesn't make sense, so I Googled her. Turns out she lost her license and spent the last 6 years in prison for dealing prescription drugs. Story 35. Had a guy's background check come up with an explosive charge once. According to him, he had fireworks in the state of California, and they don't really mess around. Story 36. Felony conviction and resulting prison time related to the suspicious death of his own son. Ultimately, he was convicted of gross negligence. The DA had tried for murder. Jeez, my heart goes out to the son, and I honestly hope that guy never interacts with kids again. Story 37. What exactly gets pulled up when they do a background check? Can they see all the companies you used to work for in the past 5 years? So in my state, it's more about every single charge you've received, from misdemeanors to full felonies. It's everything laid out for employers. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.